All right, so looking at 1 Samuel chapter 22, in the last chapter we noted, of course, that David at this point has fled. He's no longer going to see Jonathan. He'll see Jonathan, I believe, in chapter 23, but chapter 20 it ended with David leaving Jonathan. In chapter 21, this sort of began again David's run, at least time on the run for a large duration of his life. Now, we talked about what happened with the priest at Nob. David obviously lied about his business there and eating of the table of showbread that referenced in the New Testament. And what happens in chapter 21, the end result of that is not necessarily is not positive at all, as we'll see in chapter 22 concerning the fate of the priest that aided David in the city of Nob. But naturally, David, being on the run, he flees. He had fled at the end of chapter 21 to the city of Gath, which we noted is in the territory of the Philistines at this time. Gath, again, was a major city, and in some ways it might not have looked good for David to flee to this city, but at this point, with Saul as desperate as he is, David doesn't really have a lot of options in terms of where he can go for safety. And as we ended chapter 21 last week, how did David basically get out of working or get out of the jurisdiction of the king of Gath?
He pretended he's insane.
Yeah, he pretended he's insane. And as we mentioned last week, for someone to act in this manner, a lot of times it was connected to being punished by the gods, especially in with some of these cultures outside of Israel, generally, and in some cases within Israel as well. But generally, whenever somebody was not in their right mind, obviously today we understand a lot more about mental health and things like that. But back then, a lot of times it was attributed to punishment of the gods. And in this particular instance, we know that actually, David is making this up, right? It's not that God's actually punishing him. He's just acting insane to get out of the hands of Achish. And it works as we come to in chapter 22, where again David is still on the run. Our plans are to try to get down through verse 10 tonight, so that way next week we look at the latter half of the chapter in the 12 or 13 verses in that class. But again, chapter 22, beginning in verse 1, David is on the move once again. David therefore, looking at verse 1, David therefore departed thence and escaped to the cave Adullam. And when his brethren and all his father's house heard it, they went down there to him. All right, so at this point, again, David's fled the city of Gath. He's arrived at it's noted here that the cave Adullam. We're told that Adullam was about 10 miles southeast of the city of Gath, which means that it would be a trip that could potentially be accomplished within 4 or 5 hours, depending on how much travel or how much things you're having to take along with you. So it's not that far away from the city of Gath, but it is inside the territory of Judah, right? And David is a native of the tribe of Judah, and and as we'll see in a moment, the reason why he goes to the city is pretty important. The word Adullam just means closed in, or a closed in place. And generally at this time, you think about the building of cities, you often wanted to build it on a hill. And I think Brother Wayne mentioned maybe in a sermon, but generally with cities, you also at this time wanted to have large, thick walls around the city for protection. Well, another source of protection concerning the terrain of an area would be caves. You can hide out in them. We've seen David do that before. It's obviously hard to attack somebody in a cave because especially if the caves are being talked about here, you've got a lot of natural protection, and that's what David needs at this point. Now we know from other passages in the Old Testament that the cave Adullam is actually a city. In Joshua 15:35, it's listed as one of the cities of Judah, right there on the border with Philistia. And in 2 Chronicles 11 verse 7, we're told that under the king Rehoboam, this actually becomes a well-fortified city in his time, probably because this is a natural place that is easily defended. Thus, kind of makes sense why David would want to go to a place that's easily defended. He's on the run. Now, you note again, verse 1, who comes with him. When his brethren and all his father's house heard it, they went down there to him. In a situation like this where David is being hunted, basically, by Saul, naturally David's family is going to be at jeopardy. I don't know if you've ever watched documentaries about those people that are able to escape North Korea and to get into South Korea. One of the things that the North Korean government tries to do to keep people from fleeing to China or South Korea is that if they flee, that means that that person's family is often either tortured or thrown into a labor camp. And usually their family's fate ends in a very bad predicament. And sometimes that's what happens in situations like this. Not only is David in jeopardy, but those closest to David are going to be in jeopardy as well. And you see this throughout Israel's history at times. I know we've been talking about the prophet Amos in the sermons on Sunday. But one of the things about the northern kingdom of Israel is that sometimes whenever a new family took over as king, that the family of the old king would often be wiped out as well. And you kind of get that sense here, maybe what could happen to David's family, right? David supposed to be the next king. Saul doesn't want that to happen, so naturally Saul would want to go after David's family as well. And we keep in mind that Saul knows where David's family is located. And that goes all the way back to when we discussed David not being present at the festival of the new moon. And you might think about a New Testament example that's somewhat similar to this, right? Why did Joseph and Mary have to run from Herod the Great? To preserve Jesus, right? We know that the three wise men and the prophets with Herod the Great told them where Jesus would be born. And we know that Herod the Great had a lot of those babies killed in the city of Bethlehem because he knew where to go after what he saw as the challenger to his throne. And so naturally, right, David's family needs to get up and move. Needs to get out of Bethlehem. That's, you think about that being an interesting thing, right? Joseph and Mary had to get out of Bethlehem to protect Jesus. David's getting his own family out of Bethlehem to protect Jesus. So Saul is a desperate man. He's willing to do anything that it takes to find David, and that becomes clear as we move forward in chapter 22. Now we know that it's not only just his family that has gathered with him. Verse 2, everyone that was in distress, everyone that was in debt, everyone that was discontented gathered themselves unto him, and he became a captain over them. And there were with him about 400 men. Naturally as a king, you try to do whatever it takes to help your people out. And in that sense, you're a good king. Now, Saul obviously at this point is not a good king, but there are times when throughout the Bible when a king could do everything that he in his power and maybe not protect the people and not keep everybody happy, so to speak. That's why when you look at our own country, why it's a lot of times hard for one political party to hold the White House for multiple terms in a row, right? It's hard for a Democrat it's generally hard for a Democrat or Republican who served for 8 years, and then for the next party to win the White House, it's a Democrat. It's the same party that's taking over after those 8 years. Just because sometimes within parties, it's hard to please everybody, and there comes a point generally when those that do not support your party. That there becomes enough of them that they want to change. And you sort of get that. I thought about that example because it ties in well with here, because you have the picture here of people that are wanting change at the top. And that's why they have thrown their support behind David. Now, at this point there's only 400 of them, but this number is going to grow throughout the rest of this book. But you note who comprises or the individuals involved here with the individuals involved that want to support David. And, this is a point where we think about the problem of bad leadership comes forth. And Saul was a bad leader. But, verse 2, everyone that was in distress followed David. The word distress in a literal sense means a narrow place. It means the idea of compressing something together. You might think about this in a physical sense, but it's not necessarily in a physical sense, but you're thinking about a mental or an emotional sense here. These are essentially people that have, under the leadership of Saul and the type of government that he set up, in a sense they feel like there's no other option maybe than to support David. That's how bad things have gotten for them. In 1 Samuel chapter 30, verse 6, and we'll note when we get there, David and his men return to the city of Ziklag, and they see that the entire town is destroyed, basically. And it says that the people, the men within David's forces wanted to stone David, and it said that David was in distress, right? Wanting, and you think about the picture there, a general that's having his soldiers want to kill him, that would be a stressful situation to be in. The same idea here. Brother or Dad, if you would, read for us Philippians chapter 1, verses 22 through 23. That's not on the PowerPoint, but Paul uses the same sense of the word. Even though he's writing in Greek, he uses the same sense of the word in Philippians 1, 22 through 23.
But if I live in the flesh, this is the fruit of my labor, yet what I shall choose I know not. For I am in a strait between two, having a desire to depart and to be with Christ, which is far better.
So then that you keep in mind the context there. Paul was writing that from a Roman prison, and Paul at that point, being in prison, not a pleasant place to be, and certainly there, he's talking about whether or not does he need to continue on with the work, or whether it's better for him to just go ahead and die and be with Christ in heaven. And he said he was trying to get at it. It's not an easy decision for him to think about. Likewise, you get the idea here that those that are in distress, these are people that have been, whether mentally or emotionally, maybe even physically, they have found themselves to not be in a great place under Saul's leadership. Now, you note everyone that was in debt. We might think about this as people that are just wanting to get out of paying debts here. And certainly that's, a modern and an ancient problem. We have that problem today as well as people had that problem then. But when you think about debt in the context of Israel, though, it's a little bit more severe than we might think. One of the most hopeless signs that an individual had concerning his inability to pay a debt was that he often had to, and sometimes his family had to be sold as slaves. And that was something that was sort of the last case scenario. And it was sometimes a bad position to be in, even though there were a lot of things said about how servants and slaves are supposed to be treated. But in Exodus chapter 22, verse 25, in that passage, it tells us that an individual could not, if an individual made a loan out to one of his fellow Israelites, he could not charge interest for that loan. So that a little bit different than today. When loans are given today, generally there's interest to help pay back or help the person giving out the loan make money. But at that time, interest was not expected. And so perhaps you've got people here that owe a debt to somebody, but perhaps that individual has charged interest and done something they should not have. And so they find themselves unable to pay that debt. That could be a very likely scenario here. In Deuteronomy chapter 15, verses 8 and 9, talks about that within the 7th year of servitude that servant was supposed to be released of his work. And there's a warning that's given there about the individual wanting to retain that person, because generally a person became a servant to pay off debt. So you might very well have people taking advantage of one another. And that's why people are wanting to, these people have gotten away, because either the interest being charged on that debt perhaps is too great, or perhaps the person giving out the loan is not doing what he should according to the law of Moses. Perhaps that's what's going on here. I know when we read that, we think about people that didn't want to pay back their debts, but they might have had a justified reason to join David. And then finally, everyone that was discontented. Literally, the word means the bitterness of the soul. You remember when we talked about Hannah in 1 Samuel chapter 1, when she was not able to have a child. That same word of discontent was used to describe her perspective on life. And so these are individuals that, like those that are in distress, these are people that are just in general are not happy at all with what is going on. And so again, what they see in David is David's hope, or the possibility of a better future. And whereas these men have not benefited under Saul's leadership, the possibility of David being king bodes better for them. You think about that example in the New Testament, right? You think about how many of the apostles with James and John, right? And they all wanted to be the greatest in the kingdom that Christ was coming to establish, because in a earthly sense, they stood a better chance physically by going ahead and supporting Jesus, being close to him. So that way, in their minds, if he establishes a physical kingdom, they're in a position of power. Their lives would automatically become a lot better physically. And we know that Jesus was talking about the church, a spiritual kingdom, rather than a physical kingdom. But think about that in your minds as you're thinking about verse 2. These are people that see better prospects in supporting David than they do with Saul. Now, you think back to the qualities of leadership, Saul being a very poor leader at this point. Sometimes when we as leaders, and obviously we have elders and they lead a congregation, and so in that sense, right, you want to think about, and we'll note this in a minute, but looking out for every single individual within the congregation, but us as well as Christians, we have a responsibility to try to do our best to not be partial with those that we deal with. And we'll note that again as we go in verses 6 and 7. But you've got the idea that Saul's been partial, and those that Saul doesn't necessarily care about, they're very willing to help out David. Nevertheless, verses 3 through 5, David has to leave Adullam. So David went thence to Mizpah of Moab, and he said unto the king of Moab, Let my father and my mother, I pray thee, come forth and be with you till I know what God will do for me. And he brought them before the king of Moab, and they dwelt with him all the while that David was in the hold. And the prophet Gad said unto David, Abide not in the hold, depart, and get thee into the land of Judah. Then David departed and came into the forest of Hereth. Okay, verse 3, the city of Mizpah. We might recall Judges chapter 20, we read about the Israelites gathering at a city called Mizpah, but this is a different city because this is located in Moab. Now, on the surface, we might think, why is David going to Moab? Because that is a territory outside of Israel, but there are actually some good reasons why David would go to seek refuge for his parents in Moab. Who was David's great-grandmother? Ruth, right? And where was Ruth from? Moab. So, naturally, David has familial connections back to Moab, and perhaps there's a sense of hope that maybe they treat their family well. Another thing to keep in mind is that based on 1 Samuel 14:47, while Saul was king, one of his constant enemies was the nation of Moab. And so Moab had a natural reason to support David and his family because David at this point is the enemy to Saul. Keep in mind that David's fame at this point was widespread. They knew about him in Philistia. Perhaps they knew about him as well in Moab. And so any opportunity to hurt Saul, the Moabites would have jumped on that opportunity. And helping David would certainly fall within that. So David's request again is that he wants his parents protected. As you note, verse 3, father and mother, at this point they're probably older in age. I pray thee come forth and be with you till I know what God will do for me. So again, we mentioned last week David, it seems like David didn't put his trust in God in chapter 21. Chapter 22 he does, right? At this point, David's not only concerned with his life, he's concerned with his parents' life. Really no other option, at least in his mind, is that he puts his trust in God, right? He wants his parents to stay there till I know what God will do for me. David's not a man who is just sitting by waiting for it to happen. There's some people that think about that's what it means to put their trust in God, is that God does all the work and I don't have to do any. But that's not the case at all, right? We think about salvation, spiritual salvation, right? Obviously, we have to rely on the work of God through the sacrifice of His Son, the blood that washes away our sins. But within our own spiritual salvation, we have a responsibility as well, right? To follow through the plan of salvation, we have to continue to be obedient. Because when we put our trust in God, that means that we are doing our part, right? And David's a man who does his part. David certainly trusted in the providence of God. In verse 5, the providence of God arrives through the prophet Gad. All right, the name Gad, it literally means to invade or to attack. And so it's sort of interesting here that the man's name means to invade or to attack is actually to tell David that he can go back to Judah because Saul's not going to attack him, at least at this point. Or at least it's safe for David to come back. So it's kind of interesting to think about his name and what he's telling David to do. Now, Gad is going to become a close prophet in the court of David, just like Nathan would. And what this indicates to us as well, verse 5, is that not only are these 400 men on his side, but there are possibly others in Israel that are supporting David at this point too. The prophets more than very well likely are on David's side. We mentioned that Samuel was a person that trained the prophets in the city of Ramah. Samuel obviously knew that David was the next king. More than likely, those prophets that he trained understood that as well, and perhaps David had the support of the prophets on his side. Hence why Gad comes to tell David it's safe to come back. And so he goes and flees to the forest of Hereth. And we leave off with David for a time period, but we'll come back to him later. We're about to shift scenes towards Saul, but are there any comments or things that you would like to add on to what we talked about verses 1 through 5?
Probably David never imagined years back that this would happen to him, that he would have to be on the run. But like you say, at the end of the day, he did trust in God, and that's a refreshing change from chapter 21. And whatever God's will is, and he does his part, he's content to fulfill the will of God in his life. Absolutely.
Well, it also ties in. Why was David a man after God's own heart? Was it because David was perfect and didn't do anything wrong? Well, obviously not. But the idea of man after God's own heart is when he makes a mistake, he's going to do whatever it takes to correct it, to repent of it. And David, you'll see at the end of the chapter, David's going to go back to chapter 21 and talk about that incident. But chapter 21, he doesn't trust in God. Well, chapter 22, David learns from that mistake, right? And he puts his trust back into God. So, David's a man after God's own heart. He certainly understands the need to repent and to do things differently this time around. Now, verse 6. We shift back to Saul in Gibeah. Right, when Saul heard that David was discovered and the men that were with him, now Saul abode in Gibeah under a tree in Ramah, having his spear in his hand, and all his servants were standing about him. All right, so we're given the setting here in verse 6. So somehow or another, Saul has heard about David being discovered and that there are men that have assembled with him. Now you note that at this point, Saul and his men, that they are set up or they're camped somewhere near Gibeah at this point, which is Saul's birthplace. Saul is camped under a tree. You might recall in chapter 14, verse 2, that before Jonathan and his armor bearer attacked the Philistines, that Saul had set up his camp underneath a tree, and sometimes the tree itself was often connected back to the king, or that the king's place to set up his tent within a camp was perhaps right by a tall tree for whatever reason. Now I'll mention this. It is kind of interesting though that Samuel here is going to kill, we know that Saul rather is going to wind up killing the priest of Nob. It is interesting that by the end of Saul's life, the position of king that was often associated with being at a tree or setting up your tent or camp around the tree, Saul's actually buried underneath trees when he dies. And so that kind of interesting to think about that Saul enjoyed the prominence of sitting under the tree as king at this point, but later on with his death, he's buried underneath the trees in Jabesh. But Saul is basically out looking for David. Again, you note verse 6, right? What does he have in his hand? Spear in his hand, right? Generally the spear was a sign of kingly status, but when have we seen Saul holding a spear before? Yeah, the javelin, right? You know, whenever we see Saul holding a javelin within 1 Samuel, it was either to kill David or to kill Jonathan. He had intent to kill. And so you get, when you read that, you understand Saul's got evil intent with being here, right? He's ready to kill whoever is in his way. So that by verse 7, Saul's anger is, whereas you sort of get a hint of it, verse 6, with the spear being in his hand, you certainly know that to be the case in verse 7. Then Saul said unto his servants that stood about him, Hear now, ye Benjamites, will the son of Jesse give every one of you fields and vineyards, and make you all captains of thousands and captains of hundreds? So let's go ahead and read verse 8. That all of you have conspired against me, and there is none that showeth me that my son hath made a league with the son of Jesse, and there is none of you that is sorry for me, or showeth unto me that my son hath stirred up my servant against me to lie in wait, as at this day. So the picture here is Saul is actually sort of tearing into his servants. The identity, what's understood here is that these servants, and as we note, possibly at the end of verse 7, that these are also captains of Saul, that perhaps they have known about David fleeing and known of David's possible location, but they have not talked to Saul about it. And that's why Saul is upset. Verse 7 is because he thinks that he has been betrayed. Again, hear now, ye Benjamites, right? What tribe was Saul from? Benjamin. If there was anybody that was going to be loyal to Saul, it would be people from his own tribe. That would be the expectation. And if a lot of these men, again, verse 7, are captains, they have a lot of benefits under Saul. Right? Hear now, ye Benjamites, will the son of Jesse give every one of you fields and vineyards, and make you all captains of thousands and captains of hundreds. What Saul's saying here is that David, the son of Jesse, he is from Judah. If he becomes king, people of Judah are going to be made captains. People of Judah, they're going to be given fields. They're going to be given vineyards. They're going to be given the best of whatever they want because David is from Judah. And Saul's saying that it doesn't make any sense why you would want to support David at all, because you're going to lose a lot of different things by your support of David, which this does not sound all that different from what Saul tried to get to Jonathan, right? Jonathan, if you support David, you're going to lose the kingdom. But perhaps this speaks very well about the servants of Saul here, They haven't betrayed David, despite the fact that they have to face the fact that they're going to lose a lot of physical benefits if David becomes king. And again, you think about, what does it mean to seek first the kingdom of God? What does it mean to put God first? A lot of times it means having to put our own desires and our own interests and make those secondary to whatever's best for God's will. These men were willing to do that. We think about with Christians today, we need to have that similar mindset. How many times do people want to put other things right before assembling, or put other things before studying their Bible, or put other things before trying to help out with the work of the church, right? And sometimes people, and we have to examine ourselves, make sure that we're not doing this, but sometimes we do that because at the end of the day, we want to do what we want to do, because we want to enjoy life. Well, here are individuals that are, by not telling Saul what has happened with David, they're willing to sacrifice everything if it means to protect God's chosen man. And you don't necessarily think about that in this context, but it portrays Saul's servants as being very loyal to David, and being very loyal to God, because they have sided with David, even if it means losing all of these advantages stated in verse 7. Now, you can keep in mind that what Saul says in verse 7, back in chapter 8, Samuel noted that these would be things that the king would do, that he would be able to take fields and vineyards for himself to give it to his main supporters. And the things listed in verse 7, you can find that back in 1 Samuel chapter 8. But Saul thinks that he has been betrayed. All of you have conspired against me. There's none that showeth me that my son hath made a league with the son of Jesse. Apparently, this was well-known knowledge at this point, that Jonathan had supported David. Saul's angry that none of his servants, none of his captains let him know about this. There's no one that is sorry for me, or showeth unto me that my son hath stirred up my servant against me to lie in wait as at this day. There's an episode of The Twilight Zone that actually I saw, but it also sort of ties in with this, but it's a good illustration. The episode was actually sort of an indirect commentary on Fidel Castro in Cuba. At least that was the setting. The plot of the TV show was that there's a man who just came into power. He put his own government into power, and the deposing dictator gave to him a mirror that was said to show the face of his enemies. And over the course of the episode, the new leader kept looking into the mirror, and he kept seeing his closest supporters betraying him and depicting how they were going to kill him. And whenever he saw those pictures, he became paranoid and had that supporter, the main man under his government, killed. And it got so bad to the point where it was only him left. And at the end of the episode, he looked into the mirror and saw himself trying to kill himself, and he takes his own life. And the point being was that sometimes when you are so focused on power, you wind up becoming so paranoid that everyone around you becomes your enemy, becomes a challenger to the throne. And that's exactly the mindset that Saul has. None of these people have hated Saul. None of these people have wanted to kill Saul. None of these people have plotted Saul's death behind his back. But Saul is so paranoid because he's not living right that he's willing to go against any person, no matter what they have done. You know, when we talk about Scripture as well, you know, we can think about this in a sense about, in a moral sense. You know, sometimes when we don't live right, we have people around us that try to encourage us to live right. They do their responsibility as a Christian to encourage us to be faithful, to encourage us to repent. And sometimes what we want to do is we want to push them away, or we, in our minds, try to think about how they are the enemy, rather than doing a self-examination of ourselves and looking where we need to get, where we need to see where we need to correct our own problems. Saul would have benefited from doing that, but Saul's mindset is, you know, those people that are against me, even though they had a right reason, they're automatically in the wrong. And sometimes we might have that mindset whenever somebody comes to us and talks to us about things that we're not doing that are right, or certain sins that we may be living in that we need to get corrected. And the opposite of that is true, right? It's hard for us as Christians to go to someone who is struggling in sin and talk to them about that, and then all of a sudden they come and attack you, and you feel guilty for going to them and talking to them. But part of our job is to help those that are struggling in sin, even if they don't want us to help. And perhaps that gives us something to think about with Saul here. Saul was willing to push away every single individual that could have helped him out because he was so stuck on being right and living life a way that he wanted to do. But Saul does have an ally. Verses 9 and 10, and this will be where we close tonight. This is important. Why in chapter 21 stated that David saw Doeg. Then answered Doeg the Edomite, which was set over the servants of Saul, and said, I saw the son of Jesse coming to Nob to Ahimelech the son of Ahitub. And he inquired of the Lord for him, and gave him victuals, and gave him the sword of Goliath the Philistine. Now we noted, as we talked about in Amos, the Edomites were not very well thought of. Perhaps this is one of the reasons why the Edomites are not well thought of by the Israelites in the time of Amos, is that they actually one of their own ancestors tried to get David killed. He sided with Saul. And we talked about what happens here. Now, I'll note a couple things before we go in verse 10. And he, again, this is what he says of Ahimelech. And he inquired of the Lord for him. Now, keep in mind that in chapter 21, that's what David wanted from Ahimelech, but we don't actually have an indication that Ahimelech did this. Perhaps he did, but it could be that Doeg here is sort of stretching the truth a little bit. But now what causes great concern for Saul is gave him victuals and gave him the sword of Goliath the Philistine. It's one thing to help feed someone who is an enemy of the king. It's another thing to arm him, right? To give him military weapons. Within our own country today, right? If you go and, I know this happened with ISIS, I believe, but people that were either going over there and joining them, or people that were helping support them, you would get yourself in a lot of trouble, right? Helping ISIS because they were the enemies of the country, or especially enemies to our allies in the Middle East. And so aiding the enemy is a crime today that can lead to great punishment. I believe, if a gun owner or if a gun store sells a firearm to a convicted felon, he gets in a lot of trouble for that if he knows what he was doing, because you're not supposed to aid people that are you're not supposed to aid individuals in that circumstance. And that's what Saul's a paranoid individual, but when he hears that the sword of Goliath was given to David by Ahimelech, you can almost imagine that sort of drives him over the edge. And that's where we'll pick up in verses 11 through 23 next week with what happens between the priest of Nob and with Saul. Well, that being said, we'll go ahead and stop here. Are there any comments that you'd like to add on to what we've talked about?
Saul's a very insecure man. Nobody feels for me, feeling sorry for himself. It's all about him.
Right.
Very insecure.
Right. Good thoughts. We'll pick up with this next week, beginning in chapter 22 and verse 11.